In October of 1907, the American financial system came within 48 hours of total collapse. Banks were shutting their doors. Crowds were forming on the sidewalks outside of trust companies, screaming for their money. The New York Stock Exchange was days away from closing entirely. The city of New York itself could not make payroll. And the man the United States government called to fix it was not a senator, not a Treasury Secretary, and not the president. It was a 70-year-old private banker with a walrus mustache, a bad temper, and a library full of books he had been reading for decades about something most people in his world dismissed entirely: the ancient commercial principles of the Talmud. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, and the rule he applied that October did not come from Harvard. It did not come from a financial textbook. It came from a tractate written in Babylon 1,500 years before the New York Stock Exchange existed. Bava Batra, the laws of the communal fund. I want to tell you exactly what he did, why it worked, and why most business owners alive today are one bad quarter away from the same catastrophe that nearly swallowed Wall Street in 1907, because they have never heard of the rule that saved it. This is not motivational nonsense. This is history, Torah law, and the architecture of the institution that governs your money right now. Let me tell you what happened in 1907. The Knickerbocker Trust Company was one of the most prestigious financial institutions in New York, third largest trust company in the city. On October 22nd, 1907, word spread that its president, Charles Barney, had been involved in a failed attempt to corner the copper market. It was rumor, partial truth. It did not matter. By the time the morning was over, the line outside of Knickerbocker stretched around the block. People wanted their money. All of them, at once. That is what a bank run looks like. It is not about solvency. It is about confidence. The moment people stop believing a bank will honor its obligations, it cannot honor them, because no bank keeps 100 cents on the dollar in reserve. The money is deployed. It is working. It is in loans, in assets, in instruments. A run kills the bank not because it was insolvent, but because the belief in its solvency evaporated. Knickerbocker suspended payments that same day, and then it spread. Trust Company of America, Lincoln Trust. The New York Stock Exchange began seizing up because brokers could not get call money, the short-term loans they needed to finance daily operations. The exchange's president, Ransom Thomas, went to J.P. Morgan personally and told him that unless $25 million was injected into the call money market within the next 15 minutes, the exchange would close. 15 minutes. Morgan turned to the group of bank presidents he had assembled in his office and told them what was needed. He told them to provide it. In less than 15 minutes, the money was committed. The exchange stayed open, but Morgan knew that one injection of liquidity was not enough. He had seen panics before. He had lived through 1893. Right now, your money is exposed. Inflation, market crashes, economic collapse. Most people lose everything when it hits. Jewish billionaire families never do. For 3,000 years, they've used one Torah system to protect and multiply wealth through every crisis. That system is now in one book. Link in the description and first pinned comment. He understood something that very few men in American finance understood at that moment. The problem was not capital. The problem was structure. There was no permanent mechanism. Every crisis required him personally to convene the players, strong-arm the holdouts, and manufacture a response from nothing. He was 70 years old. He could not do this forever, and more importantly, no single man should have to. What Morgan built over the next 3 weeks in October and November of 1907 was not improvised. It was structured. It was deliberate. And if you understand what he built, you will recognize it. Because you have read it before. You just did not know it was there. I want you to open Tractate Bava Batra, Chapter 1, folios 8a through 9a. What you will find there is a legal discussion about something called the Kupa Shel Tzedakah, the Community Charity Fund. But charity fund is a misleading translation. The Hebrew word tzedakah comes from tzedek, justice, righteousness. The kupa was not a bowl you dropped coins into at the door of a synagogue. It was a formalized, legally structured, communally governed emergency liquidity mechanism. A pool of capital maintained by a city for moments of catastrophic need. The Talmud is very specific about how this fund must be governed. It must have 3 gabaim, 3 trustees, not 1, not 2, 3. Why 3? Because any decision involving communal money requires multiple perspectives and cannot be subject to the will of a single man. One trustee cannot be bought, manipulated, or mistaken without the others to check him. The Talmud understood something that modern corporate governance rediscovered in the 20th century. Concentration of authority over emergency resources is itself a systemic risk. The Kupa rules go further. The fund must be transparent. Those who contribute to it have a right to know how it is managed. The Gabaim are accountable to the community, not the other way around. And critically, the fund is not optional. The Talmud in Bava Batra 8b makes clear that a city is obligated to establish and maintain the Kupa. It is not a charitable gesture. It is a legal requirement of communal survival. Now think about what Morgan did in October of 1907. He convened the heads of New York's major banks. He created a pooled emergency fund, $25 million, then more. He established a committee structure to govern where the money went and under what conditions. He required transparency among the participants about their own institution's conditions. And he made participation, at least in the moment, non-negotiable. You were either part of the pool or you were on your own. And being on your own in October of 1907 meant your bank was the next to fall. 3 trustees, pooled capital, transparency, collective obligation, predefined governance, Kupa Shel Tzedakah. Every deal you've ever lost, every salary you didn't get, every contract that fell apart, happened because you didn't have this. For 3,000 years, Jewish billionaires have negotiated with 12 Talmud tactics that nobody taught you. I put every single one in one book, the Talmud Negotiation Bible. Link in the description and first pinned comment. Get it now. Now I want to address the obvious question. Did J.P. Morgan actually know about Bava Batra? Did he sit in his library on Madison Avenue reading the Talmud? Here is what I can tell you. Morgan maintained extremely close relationships with the leading Jewish banking families of his era. His principal partner in numerous transactions was Jacob Schiff of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Schiff was not merely a business associate. He was one of the most prominent Jewish philanthropists and scholars in America. He was deeply, seriously, academically engaged with Jewish law and its application to commercial life. Paul Warburg, the German Jewish banker, who would later become the primary architect of the Federal Reserve System, was also part of this circle. Warburg was a scholar of European and Jewish banking law. He had studied the Rothschild model, the Reichsbank model, and the commercial principles underlying both. These men talked. Morgan listened. He was not a man who read widely, but idly. He collected books, funded libraries, and engaged with ideas. And the idea he kept returning to in the years after 1907 was this. The crisis had been solved by a private emergency pooling mechanism that happened to work because one man had the personal authority and credibility to impose it. That was not a system. That was luck wearing the face of genius. He needed a system. But before we get to the Federal Reserve, I want to go back further. Because the blueprint Morgan was working from had roots even older than Bava Batra. In Exodus 30, verses 11 through 16, God instructs Moses to take a census of the Israelites. Every man 20 years and older is to give a half shekel, machatzit hashekel, as an atonement offering. Rich and poor alike give the same amount. No one gives more because they have more. No one gives less because they have less. The half shekel is the equalizer. It is the mechanism by which every member of the community participates in the communal fund equally and without exception. The rabbis looked at this text for generations and asked, why a half shekel? Why not a full shekel? The answer they arrived at is one of the most important principles in Jewish commercial thought. A half shekel because no one is complete alone. The full shekel only exists when two people contribute. Every individual is structurally dependent on every other individual for the fund to function. You cannot opt out. You cannot declare yourself self-sufficient. The half shekel is God's way of making the interdependence of economic life into a legal obligation, not merely a moral sentiment. Think about what that means for a moment. The wealthiest man in New York in October of 1907, Morgan himself, could not solve the crisis alone. He needed the other bank presidents to contribute their half shekel. He needed their capital in the pool. His genius was not in having all the money. His genius was in understanding that the system required collective contribution, mandatory participation, and a structure that made defection more costly than cooperation. He locked the doors of his library. That is not a metaphor. He literally locked the doors of his Madison Avenue library and told the assembled bankers they were not leaving until the commitments were made. He was enforcing the half shekel. He was collecting the kupa. He was acting as Rabbi. Now let us talk about what came next. Because the story does not end in October 1907. In November of 1910, a group of men boarded a private rail car in Hoboken, New Jersey, under assumed names. They traveled to Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private hunting retreat owned by J.P. Morgan himself. Over the next 9 days, they did something that would determine the structure of the American economy for the next 114 years and counting. The participants were Nelson Aldrich, the Republican senator from Rhode Island and the Senate's most powerful figure on banking, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Henry Davison, Morgan's senior partner, Benjamin Strong, who would become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and Paul Warburg. Warburg was the one who had the most fully formed intellectual framework for what they were trying to build. He had studied the German Reichsbank and the Bank of England. He had spent years arguing in American financial circles that the United States needed a central banking mechanism, a permanent, institutionalized Cooper, not a bailout improvised by a 70-year-old private citizen. A legally constituted, federally chartered emergency liquidity structure with pooled capital, multi-member governance, transparency requirements, and predefined rules for deployment. The document that emerged from Jekyll Island became the Aldrich Plan. It was not passed directly. Political opposition was fierce. The name Aldrich was too closely identified with Wall Street power, but it became the intellectual foundation of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Woodrow Wilson signed it on December 23, 1913, and the Federal Reserve System, 12 regional banks, a central board, pooled capital, multi-member governance, came into existence. Cooper Shell Tzedakah, institutionalized, federalized, made permanent. 3 trustees became 12 regional governors, became the Federal Open Market Committee. Pooled capital became reserve requirements, became the discount window. Transparency requirements became the Federal Reserve's reporting obligations to Congress. Collective obligation became the mandatory reserve system every bank in America participates in today. Morgan died in March of 1913, 9 months before Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. He did not live to see the system formalized, but the architecture he had demonstrated in October of 1907 became the template for everything that followed. Here is the question I want you to ask yourself right now. Do you have a Cooper? I am not asking whether your business is profitable. I am not asking whether you have a line of credit you could theoretically access. I am asking whether you have a formalized, pre-established emergency liquidity pool. A pool with defined size, defined governance, defined rules for when and how it is deployed, and a commitment to it that was made before the crisis, not during it. Because here is what almost every business owner does instead. They run lean. They keep reserves vague. They tell themselves they will figure it out when the time comes. They are counting on being J.P. Morgan, the one man with enough credibility and personal authority to improvise a solution at the last moment. Most of them are not J.P. Morgan, and even J.P. Morgan understood that the improvised solution was not good enough. He built the permanent one. The Talmud did not invent the Kuppah because communities were naive about emergencies. It invented it precisely because communities understood, from bitter historical experience, that emergencies always come. Not maybe, not possibly, always. The question is not whether the crisis will arrive. The question is whether you have the structure in place to survive it when it does. This is why I tell the business owners I work with, the Kuppah is not a savings account you open when things are going well and draw down when they are not. That is a personal emergency fund. A Kuppah is different in 3 specific ways. First, it is sized to a defined obligation. The Talmud specifies that the Kuppah must be sufficient to meet the emergency needs of the community. That means you have to know, before the emergency, what the emergency might require. For a business, this means scenario planning. What does a 3-month revenue stoppage cost you? What does losing your largest client cost you? What does a product liability lawsuit cost you before your insurance kicks in? Size the fund to the scenario, not to whatever is left over after you have paid yourself. Second, it is governed by trustees, not managed alone. If you are the only person who controls the emergency fund, you are one bad decision, one moment of panic, one moment of arrogance, one moment of denial, away from deploying it incorrectly. The 3 Rabbi rule exists because the Talmud understood that a single decision maker over emergency resources is a structural failure waiting to happen. Build a board, a committee, a group of people who have to agree before the emergency capital is deployed. Make that governance explicit. Write it down before the crisis. Third, contribution is mandatory and predefined. This is the half-shekel principle. The rules about how and when money goes into the Kuppah are established in advance, not negotiated in the moment. Negotiating during a crisis is the worst possible time to establish the rules. Everyone is frightened. Everyone is short-sighted. Everyone is trying to minimize their own exposure. The half-shekel was collected in peacetime precisely so that it would be available in wartime. Let me tell you about a moment I watched this play out in real time. I had a client, a business with approximately 40 employees, healthy revenue, genuinely good products. They had no formal emergency fund. They had a line of credit from their bank that they had never drawn on. In their minds, the line of credit was the Kuppah. Then, they had a 9-month run of bad luck. Not catastrophic, not any single disaster, just a confluence. A major client reduced their contract. A supply chain issue ate their margin. A key employee left, and recruiting took longer than expected. At the end of 9 months, they had drawn their line of credit to its maximum. The bank reviewed their covenant compliance. They were in breach on one metric. Not by much, but breach is breach. The bank called the loan. That is how you lose a 40-person business. Not to one catastrophe, to 9 months of friction and the absence of a real Kuppah. The line of credit was not a Kuppah. It was borrowed money from a party with no obligation to you in a crisis and every legal right to recall it at exactly the wrong moment. A Kuppah is your capital, your community's capital. Capital committed in advance, governed by rules, available without a counterparty's permission. I told this story once to a man who ran a family office, a serious, skeptical man who had built significant wealth and was not interested in what he called religious metaphors. He listened to the story. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So the Fed is basically a Cooper that got incorporated?" Yes, that is exactly what it is. The most powerful financial institution in the world is a formalization of a principle from Tractate Bava Batra. Is that still a metaphor to you? I want to be precise about what I am not saying, because precision matters. I am not saying that Paul Warburg or Jacob Schiff explicitly told J.P. Morgan to read Bava Batra. I am not saying that the Federal Reserve Act was written with a Talmud open on the desk. What I am saying is something more important and more verifiable than that. The principles codified in Bava Batra 8a through 9b, pooled communal emergency capital, multi-trustee governance, mandatory participation, predefined deployment rules, accountability to the community, are not decorative religious ideas. They are functional commercial engineering. They solve a real problem that every community, every city, every financial system eventually faces. How do you survive the crisis you did not predict? Jewish communities survived the diaspora, the Crusades, the expulsions, and 100 other existential threats, in part because their commercial law was not ceremonial, it was operational. The Cooper was not a suggestion, it was a legal structure enforced by the community on itself. And when a 70-year-old banker applied that structure to Wall Street in October of 1907, it worked. When a group of bankers formalized that structure into the Federal Reserve in 1913, it became the architecture of the modern financial system. The Torah is not giving you poetry. It is giving you engineering specifications for systems that survive. Here is what I want you to do this week, not someday. This week, calculate the number. What is the minimum capital your business needs to survive a 90-day revenue interruption while continuing to meet its obligations? Do not guess. Model it. Pool your fixed costs. Pool your variable costs. Pool your debt service obligations. Total it. That is your minimum Cooper size. Then ask yourself, does that capital exist right now in a dedicated, accessible, non-borrowed form? Not in your accounts receivable, not in your inventory, not in a line of credit, in liquid, immediately deployable capital that belongs to you and is governed by rules you have written down? If the answer is no, and for most of the business owners who will watch this, the answer is no, then you are building on an unstable foundation. You are waiting for the crisis to figure out the structure. You are the Knickerbocker Trust before Morgan arrived. Build the Cooper first, then grow. The last thing I want to say about J.P. Morgan is this. He is remembered primarily as a robber baron, as the man who consolidated railroads and steel and banking into the largest private financial empire in American history. That is accurate. He was also all of those things. But the reason his name survived, the reason he is still studied, still referenced, still relevant, is not because he was the richest man in the room. It is because in the worst financial crisis America had seen since the Civil War, he was the only man in the room who understood that the crisis was a structural problem, not a capital problem. You did not need more money, you needed a better architecture. He built it in 3 weeks in October of 1907. The Federal Reserve formalized it in 1913, and it has been governing the flow of money through the American economy ever since. One man, one principle, Bava Batra 8b. Tomorrow I'm going to tell you about the Talmud clause Benjamin Graham taught a young Warren Buffett in 1955, and how Warren has applied that exact clause before every single major purchase Berkshire Hathaway has ever made. The Torah is not just a holy book. It is the oldest, most tested business manual in human history. And now you have one more page of it. Subscribe so you do not miss tomorrow.